The summer heat hung over Austin, Texas, as Michael Carter loaded the last suitcase into the back of his SUV. 3 weeks in Chicago for a major marketing project wasn't exactly his idea of fun, but the promotion attached to it was too important to pass up. His biggest concern wasn't the work. It was his father. Robert Carter stood in the doorway of the small family home, leaning on his walker. At 61, he still carried himself with quiet dignity. But years earlier, an accident had changed his life. Walking long distances was difficult, and most days he preferred to stay at home rather than struggle with crowded places. "You know, you don't have to worry about me every 5 minutes," Robert said with a smile. Michael laughed. "I'll stop worrying when you start answering your phone." "I answer my phone." 3 hours later. Robert shrugged. "That still counts." The two shared a laugh. Even after all these years, Michael hated leaving his father alone for extended periods. Since his mother had passed away, it had mostly been the two of them. Before climbing into the driver's seat, Michael pulled out his phone. "I asked Jack to check in on you while I'm gone." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Your friend Jack?" "Yeah. He said he'd stop by whenever he has time. I'm not a babysitting project." "You're not," Michael replied. "It'll just make me feel better." Robert shook his head, but smiled anyway. "Fine." A few minutes later, Michael drove away. Neither of them realized that simple decision would change all three of their lives. 3 days later, Robert was sitting in the living room watching an old movie when the doorbell rang. He carefully pushed himself upright and moved toward the front door with his walker. When he opened it, Jack Reynolds stood on the porch. Jack carried a grocery bag in one hand and wore his usual easy smile. "Hey, Mr. Carter." "Jack, I was nearby, so I thought I'd check on you." Robert looked at the grocery bag, and apparently by half the supermarket. Jack laughed. "Michael threatened me." "Threatened you?" "He said if I didn't make sure you were eating properly, he'd never let me hear the end of it." Robert rolled his eyes. "That sounds like my son." Jack stepped inside. The house immediately felt less quiet. For the next hour, they unpacked groceries and talked about completely ordinary things. Sports, movies, the crazy Texas weather. Nothing important. And yet Robert found himself enjoying the conversation more than he expected. Most people treated him differently after noticing his walker. Some became awkward. Others became overly sympathetic. Jack didn't do either. He simply treated him like a normal person. It was refreshing. When Jack finally stood to leave, Robert found himself disappointed. "Well," Jack said, heading toward the door, "I should probably let you get back to your movie." Robert nodded. "Thanks for stopping by." "Anytime." Jack left. The house became quiet again. Strangely, Robert missed the sound of another voice. The next afternoon, Jack stopped by again. This time he brought coffee. The visit lasted almost 3 hours. The day after that, he came over once more. Soon the visits became routine. Robert discovered that beneath Jack's confident personality was someone surprisingly thoughtful. Jack listened, really listened. When Robert talked about life before his accident, Jack never interrupted. When he shared old stories about raising Michael, Jack seemed genuinely interested. For Jack, the visits became the best part of his week. His own apartment suddenly felt emptier than usual. His evenings felt quieter. One afternoon, while sitting on the back patio, Robert looked across the yard. "You know," he said, "most people stop calling after a few weeks." Jack looked over. "What do you mean?" "After the accident." Robert stared toward the fence. "At first, everybody checks on you." He smiled sadly. "Then life moves on." Jack remained silent. "People get busy," Robert continued. "You can't blame them. You sound like you're making excuses for them." Robert laughed softly. "Maybe." Jack looked down at his coffee cup. "I'm not going anywhere." The words slipped out before he could stop them. For a moment, neither spoke. Something about the conversation felt different, more personal, more honest. Robert noticed it too. A warm feeling settled somewhere deep inside his chest. Not romance. Not yet. Just comfort. The comfort of knowing someone genuinely cared. A week later, Michael called from Chicago. Robert answered immediately. "Wow," Michael said. "You actually picked up. Don't sound so surprised." "How are you?" "Fine." "You eating?" "Yes." "Taking your medication?" "Yes." "Everything okay?" Robert smiled. "Everything's fine." Michael hesitated. "You sound happier." Robert looked toward the kitchen where Jack was making coffee. Maybe I am. Good. Michael sounded relieved. That's all I wanted. After ending the call, Robert remained thoughtful. Michael was right. He was happier, much happier than he had been in a long time. And somehow, it had happened without him noticing. Later that evening, Jack prepared to leave. The sun was setting outside, painting the sky orange and gold. Thanks for coming over, Robert said. Thanks for letting me. Jack grabbed his keys. As he reached the front door, his phone buzzed. A message appeared on the screen. For a second, he frowned. Then he smiled. What? Robert asked. Jack turned the phone around. A text message from Robert had appeared. Apparently, while learning how to use a new messaging app earlier that day, Robert had accidentally scheduled a message. The message had just been delivered. It read, "Coffee tomorrow." Both men stared at it. Then they laughed. I guess that answers whether I'm welcome back, Jack said. Robert smiled. Looks like it. Jack slipped the phone back into his pocket. I'll be here. As the door closed behind him, neither man realized how much they were already beginning to look forward to tomorrow. Over the next 2 weeks, something unexpected happened. Jack's visits to Robert's house became part of both of their daily routines. What had started as a favor for Michael no longer felt like an obligation. Every morning, Jack found himself wondering what Robert was doing. Every afternoon, Robert found himself glancing toward the window, expecting to see Jack's truck pulling into the driveway. Neither of them talked about it. Neither of them needed to. One Tuesday afternoon, Jack arrived carrying a large paper bag from a local barbecue restaurant. Robert looked at the bag and laughed. Please tell me that isn't enough food for 10 people. Jack grinned. I got hungry. You always get hungry. And somehow I'm still handsome. Robert shook his head. The confidence on this guy. Jack laughed as he set the food on the kitchen counter. The easy humor between them had become natural, comfortable, like they had known each other for years instead of weeks. After lunch, they settled into the living room. A baseball game played quietly on television. Neither was paying much attention. Their conversations had become far more interesting. Jack stretched his legs out. So what were you like in college? Robert nearly choked on his drink. You really want to know? Absolutely. A mischievous smile appeared on Robert's face. I was trouble. Jack laughed. No way. It's true. I don't believe it. Robert leaned back in his chair. I skipped classes, drove too fast, dated people I shouldn't have dated. Jack stared at him dramatically. My entire image of you is ruined. Robert burst out laughing. For several minutes, he shared stories from his younger years. Stories Michael had never even heard. Stories about road trips, college parties, bad decisions, unexpected adventures. Jack listened carefully. The more he learned about Robert, the more he realized there was so much more to him than the man who used a walker. There was an entire lifetime of experiences behind those stories. A lifetime most people never bothered asking about. That realization stayed with Jack long after the conversation ended. A few days later, a thunderstorm rolled across Austin. Heavy rain hammered against the windows. Lightning flashed across the dark sky. Jack arrived carrying coffee and donuts. Either you're incredibly dedicated, Robert said, opening the door, or completely insane. Probably both. The storm eventually knocked out the power. The television went dark. The lights disappeared. Silence filled the house. Jack looked around. Well, there goes our entertainment. Robert smiled. Not necessarily. He disappeared into another room and returned carrying an old photo album. Jack immediately became curious. What's that? My secret weapon. For the next 2 hours, they sat together looking through decades of family photographs. Young Michael covered in mud. Family vacations. Holiday gatherings. Pictures of Robert and his late wife. Jack noticed the smile on Robert's face whenever he talked about her. There was sadness there, but also gratitude, a deep appreciation for the life they had shared. You really loved her, Jack said quietly. Robert nodded. Every day, the room became silent. Rain continued falling outside. Jack wasn't sure why, but the answer touched him. Maybe because genuine love seemed increasingly rare. Maybe because Robert spoke about it with such honesty. Eventually, Robert looked at him. What about you? Jack hesitated. What about me? Anyone special? For the first time all evening, Jack looked away. No. The answer came quicker than expected. Robert noticed. You okay? Jack forced a smile. Yeah, but he wasn't. Not really. The truth was that most of his relationships had never lasted. People saw his confidence and assumed he had everything figured out. In reality, he often felt lonely. The older he became, the more difficult it seemed to find meaningful connections. He rarely admitted that to anyone. Yet somehow, sitting in Robert's living room, he found himself wanting to. I guess I've just gotten used to being on my own. Robert studied him carefully. You shouldn't have to get used to that. Something about those words hit harder than Jack expected, because for the first time in a long time, someone seemed to genuinely understand. As the days passed, Michael continued calling from Chicago. Every conversation sounded similar. How's Dad? Good. How's work? Busy. Everything okay? Yeah. Michael never suspected anything unusual. As far as he knew, his father and best friend had simply become friends, which was true, at least technically. What Michael couldn't hear through the phone was the laughter filling the house every day. He couldn't see how much happier Robert seemed, or how Jack always stayed longer than planned, or how neither of them wanted the visits to end. One evening, after dinner, they sat on the back patio watching the sunset. The sky glowed orange and purple. For a while, neither spoke. The silence felt peaceful, comfortable. Robert finally broke it. You know something? What? I haven't laughed this much in years. Jack smiled. I'm glad. Robert looked toward him. No. His voice softened. You don't understand. Jack turned. Robert's eyes reflected the fading sunlight. For a long time, every day felt exactly the same. He paused. Wake up. Stay home. Go to sleep. Jack listened quietly. But lately, a smile appeared on Robert's face. Lately, I actually look forward to things again. The words were simple, yet they carried enormous meaning. Jack felt warmth spread through his chest, because he knew exactly what Robert meant. The truth was that he looked forward to these visits too, more than he wanted to admit, far more than he should. Neither of them said anything for several moments. The silence felt different this time, more personal, more vulnerable, almost as if an invisible wall between them had slowly disappeared. Finally, Jack smiled. Good. Robert smiled back. Good. Neither realized how much that conversation would matter later. That night, after Jack left, Robert sat alone in the quiet house. For once, the silence didn't feel lonely. His phone suddenly buzzed. A message from Jack appeared. Made it home. Thanks for dinner. Robert smiled. Without thinking, he typed a reply. Anytime. A few seconds later, another message appeared. See you tomorrow? Robert stared at the screen. Then a surprisingly genuine smile spread across his face. Looking forward to it. After sending the text, he placed the phone on the table. But sleep didn't come immediately. Instead, he sat there thinking about friendship, about second chances, about how strange life could be. Because somehow, when he had least expected it, someone had walked into his life and made the world feel a little less lonely. And neither of them knew that an even bigger conversation was waiting just around the corner. A conversation involving a secret Robert had never told anyone. The next afternoon, Jack arrived at Robert's house expecting an ordinary visit. Instead, he immediately sensed something was different. Robert seemed quieter than usual, more thoughtful. They spent the first hour talking about random things, sports, local news, and a movie Jack had watched the night before. But every now and then, Jack noticed Robert drifting into silence, as if something was weighing heavily on his mind. Finally, while they sat in the living room with coffee cups resting on the table between them, Jack decided to ask, You've been thinking about something all day. Robert looked up. What makes you say that? You keep staring into space. A small smile appeared on Robert's face. That obvious? Very. Robert chuckled softly. For a moment, he seemed unsure whether to continue. Then he slowly leaned back in his chair. You ever spend so much time hiding something that eventually it becomes part of you? Jack frowned slightly. What do you mean? Robert looked toward the window. The afternoon sunlight filled the room. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he finally spoke. After my accident, everybody focused on what I lost. Jack remained silent. My mobility. Robert tapped the handle of his walker. My independence. His voice stayed calm, but there was sadness beneath it. People always talked about the physical damage. He shook his head, but nobody ever asked about the rest. Jack listened carefully. The rest? Robert nodded. The confidence. His eyes lowered. The self-worth. The room became quiet. Jack had never heard Robert speak this openly before. I spent years convincing myself that my life was basically over. Robert laughed softly, though there was little humor in it. Not literally. He looked at Jack, but emotionally, Jack felt something tighten in his chest, because suddenly he understood. This wasn't just about the accident. It was about loneliness, about isolation, about feeling invisible. I stopped expecting people to stay. Robert continued. I stopped expecting anything at all. Jack didn't know what to say. The honesty in Robert's voice was impossible to ignore. For a long time, Robert admitted, I thought the best years of my life were behind me. Jack stared at him. You really believe that? Robert nodded. Every day. The answer hit harder than either of them expected. For several moments, neither spoke. The ticking clock on the wall filled the silence. Finally, Jack leaned forward. I don't believe that. Robert looked at him. No. Jack's voice was firm. Not even a little. A faint smile appeared on Robert's face. You make it sound easy. It's not easy. Jack shook his head. But it's true. Robert looked away. Jack continued. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. Robert laughed. Strong. Yeah. You know I need a walker to get around, right? Jack immediately shook his head. That's not what strength means. The room became quiet again. Jack searched for the right words. You lost a lot. Robert nodded. You had every reason to give up. Another nod. But you didn't. Jack's voice softened. You're still here. Robert stared at him. You raised Michael. Jack continued. You build a life. You keep moving forward even when things are hard. A long silence followed. Something changed in Robert's expression. Something vulnerable. As if hearing those words mattered more than he wanted to admit. Because nobody had spoken to him that way in years. Most people offered sympathy. Jack offered respect. And somehow that meant far more. Later that evening, they moved to the back patio. The Texas air felt warm and comfortable. The sun slowly disappeared behind the horizon. For a while, they simply sat together. Neither felt any pressure to fill the silence. That had become one of the things both of them appreciated most. The silence wasn't awkward. It felt peaceful, safe. Eventually, Jack spoke. Can I tell you something? Robert looked over. Of course. Jack hesitated, then laughed nervously. Honestly, it's kind of embarrassing. Now I'm curious. Jack looked toward the yard. I've spent most of my adult life pretending I have everything figured out. Robert smiled. You do a pretty convincing job. Exactly. Jack laughed. That's the problem. Robert waited. The smile slowly faded from Jack's face. The truth is... He paused. I've been lonely too. Robert blinked. Jack rarely talked about himself, especially like this. I always thought I'd eventually find the right person. Jack shrugged. Then years passed. His voice remained calm. But sometimes I wonder if maybe I'm just better at helping other people than building a life for myself. Robert studied him carefully. For the first time, he saw something beneath Jack's confidence. Loneliness. The same loneliness he knew all too well. You hide it well, Robert said quietly. Jack laughed. Occupational hazard. They shared a smile, but neither missed the deeper meaning behind the conversation. For the first time, they weren't discussing sports or movies or daily life. They were talking about themselves, the real versions, the versions most people never saw. The following days felt different, not dramatically different, just enough for both men to notice. Their conversations became more personal, more meaningful, more honest. They talked about fears, dreams, regrets, the paths their lives had taken. One evening, while watching an old movie, Robert caught himself laughing at something Jack said. A genuine laugh, the kind he hadn't experienced in years. Jack smiled when he heard it. What? Robert shook his head. Nothing. No, tell me. Robert looked at him. A warm feeling settled in his chest. You've changed this house. Jack frowned. What do you mean? It used to feel empty. The answer came quietly. Now it doesn't. Jack's heart skipped unexpectedly. For a moment, neither looked away. The room suddenly felt smaller, more intimate, not romantic, not yet, but undeniably important, because somewhere along the way, they had become far more than casual friends. They had become part of each other's daily lives, part of each other's happiness, and that realization scared both of them a little. A few nights later, Jack prepared to leave after another long visit. He grabbed his keys and headed toward the door. Robert walked beside him with his walker. Neither seemed eager for the evening to end. At the doorway, Jack stopped. "So?" Robert smiled. "So?" Jack opened his mouth, then closed it. For several seconds, he simply stood there. A strange expression crossed his face, as if he wanted to say something important, something he wasn't quite ready to admit. Robert noticed immediately. "What is it?" Jack looked at him. For a brief moment, every word he had been holding back nearly escaped. The admiration, the connection, the growing feelings he didn't fully understand. But fear stopped him. Fear of ruining what they already had. Fear of changing everything. Fear of being wrong. So instead, he smiled. "Nothing." Robert studied him carefully. He knew there was more, but he didn't push. Jack stepped outside. "I'll see you tomorrow." Robert nodded. "Tomorrow." As Jack walked toward his truck, he couldn't stop thinking about the words he almost said. And inside the house, Robert stood by the doorway much longer than usual, wondering why seeing Jack leave suddenly felt so difficult. Neither man realized it yet, but the line between friendship and something deeper was becoming harder to ignore with every passing day. The days following Jack's almost confession felt different. Neither man mentioned what had happened at the front door. Neither brought up the strange moment when Jack had looked like he wanted to say something important. And yet neither of them forgot it. The memory lingered. Every conversation seemed to carry a little more weight. Every smile seemed to mean a little more. Every goodbye lasted a little longer. A week passed, then another. Michael's return from Chicago was getting closer. At first, that fact didn't seem important, but slowly it became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Jack was helping Robert organize old books in the living room. The task itself wasn't difficult. Most of the time, they spent talking instead of working. As usual, Robert held up a worn novel. "I haven't opened this thing in 20 years. Jack laughed. "Then why keep it?" Robert smiled. "Some things are hard to throw away." Jack looked at him. Something about the answer felt bigger than the book. For a moment their eyes met. Neither looked away immediately. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It felt meaningful, dangerously meaningful. Jack looked down first. His heart was beating faster than it should have been. Lately, that happened more often around Robert, and it was becoming harder to pretend otherwise. That evening, Jack drove home feeling frustrated. Not because of Robert, because of himself. The truth had become impossible to avoid. His feelings were changing. What started as concern had become friendship. What started as friendship had become something deeper. And now he didn't know what to do about it. Every logical part of his brain told him to keep quiet. Nothing good could come from complicating things. Robert was Michael's father. Michael was his best friend. Their lives were already connected enough. Why risk everything? Yet every time he imagined walking away, the idea felt unbearable. Because Robert had become one of the most important people in his life. Far more important than he had ever expected. Far more important than he wanted to admit. Jack parked outside his apartment and sat in silence. For the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge the truth. He wasn't falling for an idea. He wasn't feeling temporary sympathy. He cared about Robert. Genuinely. Deeply. And that realization terrified him. Across town, Robert was fighting a similar battle. After Jack left, he sat alone on the patio watching the sunset. The sky glowed orange above the Austin skyline. Normally, he enjoyed these quiet moments. Tonight, his thoughts wouldn't leave him alone. He kept replaying recent conversations, recent laughs, recent moments. The way Jack always listened. The way Jack never treated him differently because of his limitations. The way Jack somehow made ordinary days feel special. Robert closed his eyes. At 61, he thought he understood himself. He thought he understood life. He certainly thought he understood loneliness. Yet somehow Jack had walked into his world and changed everything. The worst part wasn't the feelings. The worst part was how natural they felt, as though they had arrived quietly and settled in a place long before either of them noticed. Robert sighed. There was no point pretending anymore. He cared about Jack too, more than friendship should probably allow. The admission felt both frightening and strangely freeing. For years he had convinced himself that chapter of his life was over. Now he wasn't so sure. 3 days later, Jack arrived carrying takeout containers. Robert immediately noticed something unusual. Jack seemed nervous. Not visibly nervous, just distracted, like his mind was somewhere else. During dinner, their conversation wasn't as effortless as usual. Both men sensed it. Neither knew how to address it. Finally, Robert set down his fork. Okay. Jack looked up. Okay, what? Something's bothering you. Jack laughed nervously. Is it that obvious? Very. Jack stared at the table. For several seconds, he said nothing. The room grew quiet. Robert waited. Eventually, Jack exhaled slowly. You ever realize something and wish you hadn't? Robert smiled slightly. Depends on the realization. Jack looked up. Their eyes met, and suddenly neither of them could hide behind jokes anymore. The atmosphere shifted. Everything became serious. Everything became real. Robert's heart started beating faster. So tell me. Jack swallowed. This friendship. He paused. Robert remained silent. This friendship means a lot to me. A soft smile appeared on Robert's face. It means a lot to me, too. Jack nodded. I know. The answer came quietly. Too quietly. As if there was more behind it. Much more. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Robert surprised himself. What if it's more than friendship? The words escaped before he could stop them. The second they left his mouth, the room fell completely silent. Jack stared at him. Robert's pulse hammered in his chest. Part of him wanted to take the words back. Part of him wanted to run. Instead, he waited. Jack looked down briefly, then back up. And in that moment, Robert saw relief. Not shock, not discomfort. Relief. As crazy as this sounds, Jack said softly, I've been wondering the same thing. Neither moved. Neither looked away. Years of loneliness. Weeks of growing connection. Countless conversations. All of it suddenly made sense. The next hour became the most honest conversation either man had experienced in years. They talked about everything. Their fears. Their doubts. Their uncertainty. Jack admitted how confused he had felt. Robert admitted he never expected to develop feelings for anyone again. They discussed the age difference, the complications, the fact that Michael was involved, even if indirectly. What if he hates the idea? Jack asked. Robert looked thoughtful. He won't hate you. You don't know that. No. Robert smiled gently. But I know my son. Jack remained unconvinced. Still, hearing the confidence in Robert's voice helped. The conversation continued long into the evening. And despite all the uncertainty surrounding them, something remarkable happened. Neither felt afraid anymore. Not completely, because for the first time, they weren't carrying the burden alone. They understood each other. They shared the same fears, the same hopes, the same feelings, and that changed everything. A few days later, Michael called from Chicago. I'm finally coming home this weekend. Robert smiled. That's great. I've missed you. I've missed you too. After the call ended, Robert sat quietly for several moments. Then he looked across the room at Jack. Neither needed to say what they were thinking. Michael was coming home. The moment they had both been anticipating was finally here. The future suddenly felt uncertain again. But one thing was no longer uncertain. Whatever existed between them was real. Neither could deny it anymore. Neither wanted to. And as Michael's plane prepared to leave Chicago earlier than scheduled the following morning, neither Robert nor Jack had any idea that their lives were about to change once again. Michael's flight landed in Austin earlier than expected. After nearly 3 weeks in Chicago, all he wanted was to get home, take a long shower, and sleep in his own bed. The project had been successful. His promotion was practically guaranteed. But at that moment, work was the last thing on his mind. He missed home. He missed his father. And surprisingly, he missed Jack too. The three of them had exchanged messages throughout the trip, but it wasn't the same as being there in person. As he drove through familiar streets toward the house, he felt excited. For the first time in weeks, he was finally home. What he didn't know was that the people waiting for him were feeling nervous for entirely different reasons. Robert was sitting in the living room when he heard a car pull into the driveway. He looked through the window and immediately smiled. "He's here." Jack, who was helping put away groceries, froze. Already? Michael wasn't supposed to arrive until later. Robert noticed the sudden panic on Jack's face and couldn't help laughing. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad. This isn't funny." "It kind of is." Before Jack could answer, the front door opened. "Hello," Michael called. A second later, he stepped inside. The smile on his face immediately appeared. "Dad." Robert stood carefully with his walker. Michael crossed the room and hugged him. For a moment, neither spoke. It simply felt good to see each other again. When they finally pulled apart, Michael noticed Jack standing nearby. "Look who it is." Jack laughed. "Welcome back." The two friends hugged briefly. Everything seemed normal, at least on the surface. But over the next few days, Michael began noticing small things. Little details. Things that didn't quite fit together. His father seemed different. Happier. Lighter. More energetic. The change wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, yet impossible to miss. Robert laughed more often. He smiled more. He seemed genuinely excited about everyday things. At first, Michael assumed it was because he had survived 3 weeks without his son hovering over him. But eventually he realized there was more to it. One evening, while helping clean up after dinner, Michael casually mentioned it. "You seem happy." Robert looked up. "I am happy." Michael smiled. "Good." He meant it. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed while he was away. The next clue came a few days later. Jack stopped by unexpectedly. Nothing unusual there. Except Robert somehow knew he was coming before the doorbell even rang. Michael noticed the exchange immediately. The comfortable smiles. The familiar rhythm between them. The way conversations seemed effortless. It wasn't suspicious. It was simply close. Much closer than before. For a brief moment, Michael wondered how much time they had actually spent together during his trip. The answer, he would soon discover, was a lot. A week after returning home, Michael finally asked. The three of them were sitting on the back patio, enjoying the warm evening air. Conversation flowed easily. Then Michael looked at both men. "So?" Jack immediately looked nervous. Robert sighed. Michael narrowed his eyes. "Okay, now I definitely know something is going on." Jack nearly laughed. "Is it that obvious?" "Extremely." Robert exchanged a glance with Jack. The moment they had been avoiding had finally arrived. Michael leaned back. "Do I need to be worried?" "No." Robert answered immediately. "Not all," Jack added. Michael looked between them. Then something clicked. Not all at once. Just enough. Enough to understand there was something important they wanted to tell him. The silence stretched. Finally, Robert spoke. "Michael, there's something we need to explain." His son listened carefully. Robert took a slow breath. Then he began describing everything. The visits, the conversations, the friendship that had unexpectedly grown over the past several weeks, the support they had given each other, the connection neither of them had anticipated. Michael listened without interrupting. Jack remained completely silent. The longer the conversation continued, the more emotional it became. Not because anyone was angry, because everyone was being honest. For perhaps the first time ever, when Robert finished speaking, the patio became quiet. Michael stared down at the table, processing everything. Neither Robert nor Jack pressured him to respond. Eventually, Michael looked up. His eyes settled on his father first, then on Jack, and something surprised both of them. There wasn't anger in his expression. There wasn't resentment. There was confusion, a little shock, but mostly understanding. "You know," Michael finally said, "when I left for Chicago, I was worried about Dad being alone." Robert smiled softly. Michael looked at him. "I haven't seen you this happy in years." The words hit harder than expected. Robert's eyes immediately became emotional. Michael turned toward Jack, and honestly, he shook his head with a laugh. "You've been acting like family for years anyway." Jack smiled nervously. "That's a good thing, right?" Usually, the tension finally broke. All three laughed. For the first time that evening, everyone relaxed. Over the following months, life settled into a new rhythm. The transition wasn't perfect. There were adjustments. conversations, moments of uncertainty. But through it all, one thing remained obvious. Robert was happier than he had been in years. He became more active, more optimistic, more engaged with life. The loneliness that had once defined his days slowly disappeared. Jack changed too. His confidence remained, but something deeper had appeared beneath it. Peace, contentment, a sense of belonging. For years he had searched for meaningful connections. Now he had found one when he least expected it. As for Michael, he eventually realized something important. Life rarely follows the plans people create. Sometimes the people who change your life arrive through completely unexpected doors. Sometimes friendship grows into something deeper. Sometimes happiness appears when everyone has already stopped looking for it. And sometimes the best thing you can do for the people you love is support their happiness. 6 months later, the three of them sat around the dining room table sharing dinner. Laughter filled the house, the same house that had once felt painfully quiet. Stories were exchanged. Jokes were repeated. Plans for future vacations were discussed. At one point, Michael simply looked around the room, at his father, at Jack, at the happiness that surrounded them. And he smiled, because for the first time in a very long time, everyone seemed exactly where they belonged. The future remained uncertain, as it always would. But one thing was clear. A simple favor between friends had unexpectedly changed 3 lives. And what began as an ordinary visit had become the start of a completely new chapter. One built on friendship, trust, understanding, and the courage to embrace happiness when it finally arrives. Do you think Michael made the right choice by supporting them? Tell me in the comments. And if you want more heartwarming romance stories like this one, make sure you subscribe and join our growing community.